Welcome to Regulate Tech. This is our 19th episode of 2022, I think.
It is.
We're still 2022.
Just about, yeah.
Yes, and we thought we would talk about content moderation, but before that we also thought we would extend our thoughts to the many colleagues that are currently facing challenges and difficulties because of the current state of the labor market and the layoffs that we've seen. And there are a lot of really good people on the market right now.
There are, and I think it's made headline news, hasn't it? All around the world that there have been these very, very significant cutbacks. I think particularly at Twitter and Meta, but Amazon I just saw announce them as well. And it's generally a time where there's a tech sector contraction, and without going into the ins and outs of the economics or what's going on, I think just as you said, Nicklas, as human beings, a lot of these people are people that we know who've moved around the different companies, and many of them are good people, highly professional in terms of the job that they do, and very personable people that you enjoy spending time with.
Very much so.
And so at a human level, I think you and I have probably both been scanning our social media feeds and our inboxes just to check, who's okay and who's having to find themselves another job. So just a moment.
And there's been a couple of initiatives where people are making lists and connecting folks, and so keep your eyes out. We'll put some of those in the show notes as well. So yes. Moving on then, one of the things that we've come back to often when we've talked about tech policies is sort of this core issue of content moderation. And you've been thinking a lot about this and thinking about how do you construct a model that makes it easy to think about content moderation and understand the different aspects, and you've been working at it. So why don't you bring us up to speed a little bit with what that model looks like?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very topical both for the regulatory agenda. We've got things like the European Digital Services Act and the UK Online Safety Bill, but also all the debates around Twitter and front and centre at the moment. What is their policy, or is their approach going to change? What could the alternatives be? So I just wanted to take a step back, and I've actually been writing something. So this unusually this podcast will go out with a written piece, which is going to appear on my blog at regulate.tech around about the same time as the podcast.
That's a nice one for us. I like that.
Different format. And it's because then it helps me sort of visualize and set out what all of the different elements might be in a sort of structured way in the post, and then be able to discuss it with you and get some expert feedback myself in this format. And so really I was thinking about that when we step back, there's a tendency just to focus on what the platforms do. That I report it to the platform has policies, the platforms take it down. But I mean, the first insight is to say, look, that exists within a much, much sort of broader set of actors who can take content down. A lot of them are content owners themselves. And I sort of divide it into 6 different sets of actors, and I could just give the headline, then we can dig into them. And they're in 3 different buckets. So there's the content owner bucket, and there you've got the person who posted the content, which is what I would call auto-moderation, in the sense of self-moderation. And then there's often a community moderation layer. It depends on the platform, but a lot of systems that there's content is posted within some kind of managed space, and the community does moderation. Then you've got the classic platform moderation, and sometimes that's the platform themselves, the people they hire who sit there and look at content. But also platforms use external experts in different roles and different degrees, and we could talk about that. So the platform, though, sort of controls their own moderation, and they decide when to bring in external experts. And then the third bucket is the government regulation. And again, that happens in 2 different forms. One is the takedown notice. So government passes laws that lead to people having the right to insist that content's taken down, but that's item by item. And then this new thing that we're seeing, which is government actually says, look, I'm appointing a regulator, and the regulator is going to oversee everything that you do, and that's a major change. So the 3 buckets: content owners, platforms, and governments, and all of them have decision-making power in different contexts and different capacities.
Yes, and one of the things that is interesting when you look at content moderation is that they have decision-making capacity in different instances, but they also approach this very differently, don't they? I mean, there is if you're a content owner and you take something down, you can take it down purely because you didn't like it, and you say, oh, that was not what I wanted. I just deleted that, or I took it down, etc. But then as we move away from the content owner over to the governments, the criteria become more and more robust, right?
Exactly. The reason you're doing it is different, and the auto one is interesting. I don't have data, but I have a sense that I think auto moderation may actually be the biggest by volume. The most sort of common thing that people do is they post content, they regret it, or they get feedback. And in fact, Facebook used to sort of try and build
which is soft community moderation, right?
Soft community, yeah. And if feedback be you ultimately decide, you can take
or
it down.
Or bullying, worst case, I suppose.
Yeah. And it is the mode, actually, when you think about it, that a traditional media outlet does, like a newspaper. Newspaper, the content of the media outlet is auto-moderated. The media owner decides when to put it up, and they decide if they want to withdraw a story and take it down again. It's actually the default mode for blogs. If you own the blogging system that you publish on, I'll decide when to publish a blog post on regulate.tech, and I get to decide, if I want to withdraw that post and take it down again. So it's actually a very sort of embedded mode. And I actually think the common cry, I think, from free speech advocates is almost, that should be the only mode. Like, you should always, have the absolute right to decide when to publish and when to withdraw. But we can dig into why that's not going to be possible, out there in the real world. I mean, to be candid, if you own the whole stack, if I have a computer in my bedroom and I put WordPress software on it and I publish on it, there probably is nobody who can moderate my content other than myself.
The
service provider
could sort of
they could cut me off, but not in a classic sort of classic moderation.
It's not moderation, it's more access.
It's more access. They could deny me access. So that's still a feasible world, but for most of the time, most of us are publishing content using somebody else's infrastructure, and that's where all these other layers come in.
And I think across the content owners, the platforms and government, there's another thing that also is really different and quite interesting to think about, and that is that they optimize for different things.
Exactly.
And so let's talk about what the optimization function is for, government, platform, and content owner.
Yeah.
What is it that they're trying to accomplish with their either self-imposed moderation or the moderation by law?
I mean, I think, again, candidly, generally for the individual content owner, the experience of having their content removed is nearly always negative. I mean, they may choose to remove themselves because they're thinking of their personal reputation or somebody they've upset, or how they
or
come
just
across.
How they look. I mean, it's often also part of their identity, right?
Exactly.
This is who I want to be. This is how I want to express myself. And if they see that there's something jarring or a dissonance being created, then at that point they may just choose to take it down. So it's self-representation when it comes to the content owner, right?
That's exactly right. It's how they want to be perceived that is really their driving force. And then for community, it's how the community wants to behave. There's a set of rules, a set of norms within that community. And actually, really interestingly, if you follow the whole debate about people leaving Twitter to go to Mastodon, this federated service, what you're seeing is a lot of people going, oh my God, I joined this Mastodon community, and they're incredibly restrictive in terms of what they think that you should publish, because they've established a set of norms. They've created in what they'd often see as a nice environment where they don't want any jarring speech, and the jarring speech is actually quite broad the way they've defined it. So communities, their approach to moderation is how do we enforce community norms. Normally, there can be exceptions. You can create a community which is, we all want to say the most hateful things possible. And we've seen instances of that where people have been thrown off the major platforms and they've sort of gone out and said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to create hateful spaces. Yeah. But generally speaking, it's people trying to create, I say, sort of well-behaved, well-managed spaces.
And more than that, they can optimize also for quite narrow functions. So you can imagine a community of scientists exchanging papers that they think are relevant to the subject they all have in common, or a community of artists that are exchanging pieces of art that are relevant to the projects they're involved in. And so the interesting thing about communities is that they have this enormously broad spectrum of optimization functions that they can go for. Right?
Yeah, and a lot of it is that relevance point. So this classic thing, that's off topic. Take it somewhere else. It's not welcome in this community, not because it's evil, but just because it's not relevant. And we're trying to optimize for the signal to noise ratio. We want a lot of signal in this community, and that stuff is noise. So please take it elsewhere.
And it's so interesting because in some sense, I saw this. There was a tweet actually a couple of months ago. I wish I remember who wrote it, but they said for community moderation, you could actually start from thinking that you should be moderating a community where you don't know the language, and you could still do quite well, because you could see the patterns of relevance emerge from what people are posting, and you could even though don't not know the language, you could moderate really well in a community. That doesn't go for self-representation, but it actually goes for communities.
Exactly, and actually they have been tremendously successful. And so we look, Reddit is the standout example. The subreddits Many of them have been done really, really well over the years. In the Facebook context, you have Facebook groups and pages. But what's interesting, and this is again, I'm sure there are academic studies of this which we should really go and look at. But there is something around size of community and coherence of community. So a small coherent community moderation is generally going to work extremely well. A less coherent community, as in the people are more diverse in terms of their expectations of what happens in the community, can tend to sort of break down. And a very large, very incoherent community, which will be the entirety of a social network platform, community moderation really, really struggles at that point. And there's no consensus around what the norm should be. And there may not be sufficient respect for the community moderators, because that's the other point. In some communities, everyone can moderate. But more normally, as a community grows, you appoint some people to be your moderators, the guardians of the community.
And this point about norms that you make, I think, is fundamentally important, because here we have an example of what the German sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies used to call Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. This idea that you have the village, the small village, tightly knit, that can carry really strong norms and enforce them almost brutally, right? It's not necessarily nice to be the outsider in a village, but they can really enforce them. And that is the small, close-knit community. Yeah. And then you have Gesellschaft, which Tönnies says is the modern city. So the modern city as a social construct, there are no norms for the modern city. There are many different norms, and you seek out your norm communities within the city, but the city itself has no norms. And it's surprisingly, I think it's a surprisingly low number of people needed to transition from village to city.
Yes,
in a way, right?
Yeah, and you see that in the real world, in that there are many villages in countries around the world that function perfectly well without a permanent police presence. I don't know of any cities that manage to do that. It's just different once you get to a certain stage.
Tokyo is fairly close.
But there's generally their need for more than a social norm. But you're right, that may be Tokyo, maybe a standout example that there are the power of the social norms is village-like in its intensity and
closer to Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. I think that's right.
Normally, you at that point in a city need to have some kind of enforcement. So that sort of these questions around the sort of the extent to which communities can moderate themselves. There's another feature of communities. Look, as long as they're closed communities, arguably, what goes on in that community shouldn't be a problem to anyone else. And that again can survive. I think Reddit again was like that for a long time. That people said, look, if you don't want that stuff, don't join that subreddit. And there's a kind of live and let live. But actually, I think what we've seen again over time is that even if you're not a member of the community, that people would be, worried about what's happening in a Facebook group, other Facebook users, even though, they're not in that group, they don't have to see the content, but the fact that it exists in a shared space starts to become problematic. So community moderation, is limited, or that sort of community respect for community moderation is tempered by the fact that people may not want it to exist, even if everybody inside that closed community is happy with it.
And that's a little bit about the permeability of the community. If you can join it and find out all of this horrible stuff and then tell others, then there's something about that triggers people. But if it's completely closed, if it sort of has a hard shell, if it's sort of not even, if it's opaque to others, then those communities can live quite well. And that's what you see in places like Telegram, for example, that have fairly close communities where we don't really know what those communities are. And I'd argue that we probably have a larger set of communities that we don't know what they're discussing now because of the overall trend in content moderation towards trying to moderate the open spaces into villages.
That's right. But if it's on a major platform and the content's sufficiently upsetting, and again, it's interesting, although Telegram's a weird hybrid, but actually for most personal messaging, the content isn't being hosted. So if you have a problem, the message went from person A to persons B, C, D, and E, but the platform can't intervene because it's no longer hosting the content. It's flown from phone to phone.
It's sort of true for Mastodon, I think. I should dig into that. I don't know the architecture well enough.
But where the content is on a host, then what you then get is, look, if the content is sufficiently problematic, even if it's in a closed group, and again, there's our experience of Facebook, people who are worried about that kind of content will go and infiltrate the closed groups, and then they will still come back and say, oi, platform, you've got to moderate this. Even though all the people in the group are happy with their community moderation, it's a hateful community and should not be allowed on your platform. Therefore, if somebody else can act, the expectation is that they should act. Even though there wasn't a complaint from within the community.
Oh, now we move to the platforms then.
So yeah, now we're heading up the stack. So we
the stack. We're at we left the communities, rich in variety and content and subjects and functions, and we're moving on to the platforms.
And their role sort of kicks in for a couple of reasons. I mean, one we should recognise. Look, if you were a platform, actually, if the community and the users did all the moderation, that's a happy place to be, because A, it's really, really cheap. You're not having to pay to hire all these moderators, and B, actually the users will probably be happier if nobody else is intervening with their content. They feel a much stronger sense of control. So you probably have happier users for less money if it's all auto moderation and community moderation. But here's a big problem: you have legal liability if it's your platform, and so there's both two things. One is strict legal liability, like if somebody comes to you and says there's stuff going on and it's not being moderated by the content owners or the community, you've got to have a system to deal with that. And then the other is your reputation. So there's legality, but also reputation.
Commercial viability on top of reputation as well.
Which will come in. We'll talk about the sort of factors that influence that. But yes, your reputation becomes critical. So if you're known as the bad platform, then you're going to have to intervene more. And again, you see this trend over time. I think Reddit now has a lot more intervention than it used to do. As soon as a platform moves front and center and people are starting to focus on it and they start seeing the bad stuff, then they say there'll be one element which is, look, you're allowing illegal stuff, crack down on that. There'll be another sort of push which says, look, whether or not it's illegal, you just shouldn't have it there.
Let's double click on that. So what is it that's happening there? Because in some sense, there are a lot of platforms. Some platforms grow large, but is it size only that triggers this particular scrutiny? Or is it that they've moved into, I'm thinking about Reddit, moved into some kind of public sphere, that we recognize them as a place that people refer to, that you go to, that's become a source of knowledge? Is there like not just size, but a slight institutional shift in the role that they play?
I think it's you're right. It's not just size. I think it's attention, and I mean, a lot of attention is complaint driven, and complaints depend on people's expectations. So if you expect a platform to be terrible and you go there and it is terrible, that may not generate many complaints, because people are like, well, that's what you expect. And actually, you see the big social media platforms often treated quite differently. If you went there and expected it to be safe, or your children were on there, and you look and the things that they're seeing are terrible, then that's going to generate complaints. And once you generate complaints and you've got people upset about it, that's going to express itself through media, through politicians, through the users themselves pushing back, and so you start to get this dynamic where your reputation is under threat. So it's not strictly speaking like content of type A leads to pressure in every case. It's content of type A in a particular set of circumstances where it's upset a particular group of people because their expectations have not been met. That leads to a series of complaints, and those complaints get amplified by people who may, the media may well have an interest in it sometimes, But the point being that once it's been amplified, and your platform's name is being dragged through the mud as tolerating things it shouldn't tolerate, at that point the pressure is on you to step up and act. And I think Reddit had a bit of that for a time. Like, people were like, well, Reddit's just a place where people do crazy stuff and leave it alone. And then over time it became more mainstream, and more people are using it, and there's more attention paid to it. And their decision is, I mean, in blunt terms, do they go in the 4chan direction? Wow, we're just full of crazy stuff, don't worry about it. Or if they want to have a serious business and they want to turn it into something long-term sustainable, they perhaps need to go more in the Twitter direction. So they had a fork in the road.
I think, and I want to come back and modify the metaphor that I introduced before about the village and the city, because I think the communities are the village and the platform is the city. Because in a city, you're quite fine with some part of the city being shady.
Yeah.
And, lots of stuff happens there, and I don't know what's up. You shouldn't go there after nightfall, and, there's all kinds of crime, and really not a good place. But if you want to go through gentrification, which is sort of the process that you could describe what Reddit has been through. It's sort of a gentrification, right?
Yeah.
It's becoming a more commercially viable place. It's becoming a place where more mainstream users are looking for information. And when that gentrification happens, it's almost like you clean up a part of the city, and suddenly that part of the city needs to fulfill very different expectations from the citizens than it did before. So you have your village in the communities, and then you have this rich city, which the platform is sort of not the city itself, but it's a neighborhood in the city.
Yeah.
So the city is made up of all platforms, and some neighborhoods you're fine with being shady because you just know you shouldn't go there. It's like 4chan. 4chan is you're on the wrong side of the tracks, man.
Yeah.
Go home. It's not going to work. And then you see these movements, the gentrification movements of some part of the city, some platforms in this ecosystem that want to climb the commercial ladder or more sort of just improve their reputation. There's something about that.
I think that's the dynamic, and I think the critical thing is, look, if you want a long-term, sustainable, viable business, actually it brings us back to the current Twitter discussion, but I think it seems to be pretty obvious that a long-term, sustainable, viable platform business has to gentrify.
Yeah.
If it's going to be one, and so you see Telegram is again an interesting example. And their current position is they don't want to be mainstream. They're incorporated outside of all the major jurisdictions, and they have a very sort of free.
The old style Soho, right?
Yeah,
There is a speaking. I don't know London, but sort of like an area like that. And what's interesting actually when you talk about Twitter is that of course we also see the opposite in cities where we see a neighborhood that was formerly quite posh sort of go down in disrepute, and we tend to forget that. But if you look at it, the history of platforms, if you look at say Friendster or even Second Life, to take an extreme example, Second Life is like a ghost part of the city right now. It's nobody goes there. It's just a horrible place. Don't go there. It's just squatters living in buildings.
And it went through a phase where it was very sexual, and I mean a lot of the reputational damage was precisely that. Have you seen what people are doing there?
Yes,
sex and gambling.
It's essentially flying dildos was the latest quote I heard, which was like what?
And that drove people away. They left it.
And so that again, with that city image in your mind, you suddenly see how some neighborhoods fall into disrepute and just completely, stay away.
So back to your question about incentives. So the incentive of the platform is, to have a reason. Well, some of them might want to have a shabby neighborhood.
but this is
most
good,
though. Most of them want a gentrified neighborhood.
But the reason they want a shabby neighborhood is that when you look at this, and this is an ensemble point that I think is often lost. It's a city that has no shady parts whatsoever becomes sterile and boring, and nobody wants to go there, and it feels a little bit artificial. So in a sense, there's always going to be a niche for shady areas, as long as they don't become too shady, so that the rest of the city starts to, there's like a spillover problem, there's a bleed over problem of crime or something like that. So there's there's another level of this that we haven't discussed, which is the moderation of the total ecosystem, the sum total of platforms.
And I think that's something that's going to come through in the regulation, because when you regulate, typically people regulate for uniform standards.
Yeah.
But in this case, we're saying, you're right, if you want the internet space to be vibrant, then the regulator's going to have to apply differential standards, which is a kind of extraordinary concept of, you're the Oxford Street, which is the main posh shopping street in London. Just like we would in real life, we expect the managers of Oxford Street to manage it to a different standard from the managers of some sort of local high street in a poorer part of town.
And honestly, we also allocate police differently.
Yeah, all resources,
Right, so in terms of the government regulation, to your point, one of the things we see in cities is that there's actually, some places have less crime, because if something happens there, the regulation is fast and direct and intervenes with maximum force.
Yeah.
But some places, you report a crime if you're in the wrong part of town, police say you shouldn't be there.
Yes, and 3 weeks later, if at all, someone...
they get you a note where you say, we looked into it and we couldn't find anything.
Exactly, But again, to sort of keep going with your analogy, I mean, it's a thankless task running a neighbourhood, and you'll always get upset if you gentrify. You'll upset a whole bunch of people who think you've gentrified too much. If you let the neighbourhood slide, you'll have a whole bunch of people complaining that you've let the neighbourhood.
Plus, the neighbourhood becomes kind of iffy to live in. So
and so then again, back in sort of platform land. You can never get it right, and so whatever decision you make, you'll end up pissing off a bunch of people, like whichever direction you go in and your content moderation decisions. And so that then, I mean, in a sense, what we're experiencing and have experienced over time is platforms, I think, doing the best they can in the circumstances, but more and more voices of dissatisfaction, and it's cumulative. You irritate one community this year, and then next year you irritate 3 or 4 different communities, and cumulative over time you get to the point where we are now, which is where I think all these regulations come from, where there are so many disgruntled communities that they're now saying, look, the platforms cannot be trusted to manage the moderation themselves. These people can't be trusted to manage an area of the city themselves. They are making poor decisions, and so I want somebody else to step in.
Yeah, a bit like New York when they decided that you can't leave every neighborhood to its own group, but you want to have some kind of central management as well.
That controls it. And the first stage or the first response, I think, from platforms to that dissatisfaction, because they're very acutely, I know I was there, you're acutely aware of it every day because people are banging on your door telling you you're doing a terrible job and sort of holding you in front of committees and, lambasting you. So you know that people are upset with it. And so the first response, I think, for platforms is to try and seek some kind of third-party validation for what they're doing. So the next step is this thing which I call external expert moderation. And actually, again, there's a lot more of that than people think. That's why I'm trying to tease out the iceberg here. There's a tip. The tip of the iceberg is the classic content moderation. But actually, there's a huge amount of other things going on. And one of those is a much greater reliance on external experts. I think, again, part of the motivation is to try and it's a defensive one by the platforms, so it's not all us. But you can look at things, there's not just the oversight board that Meta created, which is a very high profile example where they very explicitly said, you don't trust us, so we're going to empower some other people to look at some of our decisions at least and override them. But there's also expert groups in child safety, in counter-terrorism, in a whole host of other things. Meta has a great fact-checking program, a great big fact-checking program where they've effectively outsourced the fact-checking piece of moderation to a network of bodies around the world. So there's a lot of this going on where the platforms, they've not surrendered control because they're inviting people in, but they are working with experts on individual slices of their moderation policy.
Yeah, that's right. It's like hiring a private guard firm for your neighborhood, in a sense. But the guard firm is slightly more. What the experts do is not really that. What the experts do is that they tell you how you can act in order to make your neighborhood more valuable. But
maybe this does work in real life as well. So you take an area like child safety. If you work in local government, certainly in the UK. Your key partners in as a local government child protection agency are often local NGOs. They're people outside, they're experts.
Oh, you're right, yeah.
Who work in, there's an organisation called NSPCC and there's others here. And so you're often co-opting experts from NGOs and from the community to help you do that. And interestingly, some of those same organisations are the ones now either criticising or working with the platforms.
Yeah,
so there's a kind of parallel in the real world.
And the pattern is interesting because it also leads to certification, right? A certain set of rules and standards that you're supposed to abide by, and those standards, if you abide by them, give you a sort of get out of jail free card. You're doing this right. You're doing all of the things that you can be expected to do.
And it's a range of counter-extremism would be another that a lot of local authorities will work with experts on countering different forms of political extremism. They're not going to do
and they know which
solo.
Neighborhoods to look at, and they also usually are actually quite nuanced about the way they do this. They don't say you can't live in that neighborhood, but they try to find mechanisms to intervene that are not necessarily about shutting down the neighborhood because you can't, but figuring out how you can intervene at an early age with people in school, or trying to find better role models, or all those kinds of things. So it seems in a way as if you're seeing a convergence between the virtual and the real world in terms of the social patterns that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of parallels, a lot of reason. The rationale for doing this is very similar. It's recognizing, I mean, two things. One is that you literally don't necessarily have all the expertise, and two, even if you did, you need to work with the experts out there in the community. And if you don't, whatever you do is going to be invalid. And again, I think that's the experience of the online platforms. Even if they get it right, the fact that they made the decision without working with the experts on counterterrorism, whatever, means that no one's ever going to see their decision as valid. So it's much, much better to work publicly with a counterterrorism or a child protection organization and demonstrate that you've got joint shared standards. You're working with someone else.
I like that. And I think that if you think about the dynamic between different platforms or different neighborhoods in our extended metaphor, there's like two levels of improvement here, or two levels of change. One is a platform can look at another platform and say, oh, they're doing this much better. They've been validated much better. I need to do that. So there's intra-platform competition. And then there is the platform being regulated by the regulator, which we'll come back to.
That's.
But out of interest, which one do you think drives most change? And what's the healthiest dynamic there? Should it be competition between platforms, or should it be regulation? What do you think is, if you look at a city healthiest when neighborhoods are competing about being attractive, or is it healthiest when there's a central regulator saying, here's what you need to do?
Yeah, I think there's a real limit to the competition between platforms as a positive force, because they, that's not, they're not too, what they don't want to be is the worst, but it doesn't make you want to be the best, if that makes sense. I'm not sure. Yeah. And again, it's not a race to the top. That's in other areas, and I think there's sometimes a perception that, like if consumers were making choices on that basis, yes, that might work as a dynamic. And people also say this about privacy. I'm not convinced that consumers are sort of they will be worried about privacy and security and safety and all of these issues, but I'm not sure that's a sufficient force in their decision making compared with things like convenience, speed of application, functionality, which of my friends are on the service. And so it's a force, but it's a relatively low force. You don't want to be the bottom. You don't have a bad reputation, but there aren't really strong incentives for you to say, well, I'm going to spend twice as much as the platform down the road to make sure that they get rid of 90% of the hate speech quickly. I'm going to get rid of 98%. I'm not sure that's sufficiently compelling for a platform to make that decision independently as a business case.
That's probably true, and it's actually probably true for neighborhoods too, because at some point you're going for good enough, you're not going for best possible. Exactly. Because best possible is really, really expensive, right? It's super expensive.
Yeah, and from a platform point of view, this is sort of you can invest and invest and invest away, till the cows come home. One thing I just would say on the external experts, I think one interesting dynamic there, and we should sort of flesh it out, which is that there is a tendency, or there is a criticism, which I think has some justification, that the platforms will work with the external experts. They'll choose external experts whose advice they're happy to take, and not work with external experts whose advice they disagree with. And I think that's a reasonable and sort of fair criticism. I think they try and make efforts to bring critics in, but there's sometimes a dynamic where they're not doing that. And again, if we take our real world analogy, if you're a local authority and there's a child safety group that just says, you're terrible, you're terrible, you're terrible, you're less likely to work with them than the one that says, we'll work with you to try and provide child services. So it's just...
but that's also more creative. I mean, it's not just human nature. It's actually that if you want to accomplish something, it's hard to invite somebody who has nothing but criticism for your approach. So I think there is a fine line here between between being a critic in a way that encourages change and understanding that change might take time, etc., and then being a critic for the attention that it gives you as a critic. There is something there that's sort of tricky, I think.
That's true, but then there are also some critics who are saying, look, I do want you to spend 10 times as much on this thing. And from my perspective as an NGO, if you did spend 10 times as much tackling the problem that I worry about, that would be good.
Yeah, so there's legitimate criticism that is not picked up. I think that's true.
Yeah, and some of it is just like I'm making what the platform sees excessive demands, but the demands themselves are not crazy.
Yeah.
They're just more than the platform is willing to stand.
Or maybe they start at a higher level than where the platform currently is willing to go.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's like coming into a really shady part of town and saying, I think you should be Dubai.
Yeah. Spend the money and make it Dubai.
Yes, interesting. So now we're moving from the expert. And we're sliding up to the ultimate monopoly of violence.
Yeah, the government. Yeah. So there are two different ways in which the government, I think, does effectively enforce content moderation, and which is to say, it's content moderation sort of by government. And the first is that nearly every country in the world has passed a bunch of laws that make certain kinds of speech illegal. And having done that, having written into law that this kind of speech, and that's everything from child abuse images through to, illegal use of copyright materials. There's a very broad range of things. And having said there are criminal and civil penalties for anyone who facilitates access to this, you are basically saying, that my expectation is that platforms will moderate this. And then there are different people who on a daily basis enforce the moderation. When it comes to copyright material, rights holders send in millions of notices, which are these legal notices with the backing of government saying you must moderate this content. Something like child abuse material, it might be the police or it might be an NGO who are sending these things in. But there's a lot of content moderation that's going on, backed up by legal powers. The platforms don't have discretion. It's not their choice. They can choose to defy the law, but again, if they're at all serious about being a long-term viable business, they won't do that. But typically they're just going to respond. They get the notice, they'll do what they're legally required to do. Principally in their country of establishment, they can't get out of there, and then in any other country where they have a significant base. They may choose to defy these notices in countries where they don't have people and where it's less important to them.
Or where there's also this element of recognizing legitimacy in the requests, I think.
Exactly. So there's some wiggle room around it. But basically that is, when government passes laws making speech illegal and there's some kind of liability placed on the platforms, we should see that for what it is, which is a way of government sort of indicating how it wants content to be moderated on a sort of item by item basis.
Yes, and usually it's not media dependent. So usually that's true for content throughout society. It's a limitation of the sphere of expression. It's not a rule targeting the platforms.
No, it's saying wherever this appears, and again it can vary from law to law, but typically there's some kind of facilitation, distribution sort of clause in the legislation that will say you must do this. And so it's item by item. The enforcement bodies are sort of many and varied, but it can lead to systemic changes as well. On the basis of, look, if you're a platform and you are continually getting notices about a particular form of content, and you estimate that you now have serious legal risk, exposed to legal risk, you may then put in place system, you may change your policies and change your platform moderation policies to match the legal requirement. And the standout example is copyrighted material. Pretty much every major platform has automated systems that just identify and sweep copyrighted material off of them. And strictly speaking, the law is not, it's changed recently, but the law for many years didn't say you had to do that. In fact, it said you couldn't be required to do it. It's supposed to be an individual notice from an individual rights holder, but cumulatively the risk gets to the point where it's not worth doing.
And there were also industry agreements and new tools being developed, etc. And there is, especially I think the DMCA in the US, that left some room for determining liability vis-a-vis the measures that were taken by the parties to the conflict.
Yeah, but that law sort of changed again. And another example on the criminal speech side would be, look, Holocaust denial is a criminal offence in a number of different countries, and the platform I used to work for, at that time, Holocaust denial was not strictly against its terms, but it effectively changed its rules, its policies for those countries where it was illegal, so that its own moderation system has sort of built the legal requirement in. And in fact, Germany, interestingly, their Network Enforcement Act is effectively a way of trying to boost that model by giving every individual the right to issue a legal notice and requiring every platform to respond to that legal notice. And
there's another effect here that's interesting to talk about, because we talk about this as if it's a legal environment that's given, and in this legal environment there are certain pieces of content that are going to be brought down. But the focus on pieces of content is not entirely truthful, because one second order effect is that if you get a lot of notices about a piece of content from a specific speaker, then at some point the second order effect will be that platforms will start looking at blocking not the speech but the speaker.
Exactly.
So there's slides. So depending on the intensity of the regulatory climate, you can see second order effects that come through platform moderation, which is voluntary but is a shorthand for trying to minimize risk.
Exactly. And for the platform incentive, when they're responding, the issue that's top of mind for them is legal risk. Yeah. And you're right, a speaker who is consistently exposing them to risk, they're going to potentially then try and remove them altogether, because otherwise, I mean, it's expensive, frankly. You're spending your whole time doing legal reviews of all these endless, complaints coming in. And if they are problematic, if the speech is problematic and illegal and is happening on a repeated basis, then that starts to raise a red flag. We should look at, again, you rightly raised, what's the motivation of the moderators in each of these sections. And here the motivations are different. So the motivation of the copyright holders is obviously protecting their property. So there's a whole bunch of intellectual property stuff where the motivation is that of people protecting their property, and they have persuaded lawmakers to give them the legal tools to do so. The motivation of the lawmakers is to keep the copyright holders happy because they're seen as productive members of their society. The motivation of those sort of pursuing other forms of criminal content, again, can vary, but it's usually often it's organizations. It will be a child safety organization or an anti-hate speech organization or a law enforcement body that's simply trying to enforce the law. And again, the motivation of the policymaker is clean neighborhoods. The reason they pass those laws is because they see that without restricting that speech, without creating that legal risk, their societies are going to be damaged in some way.
Yeah, and the slightly more the more high ground version of this argument is to say that if the platforms optimize for their reputation or for their commercial viability, what the regulator is supposed to optimize for are human rights.
Yes.
Of different kinds. And actually, copyright is a human right, privacy is a human right, the right to your life and to your property is a human right.
Exactly.
So in some sense, this is the community having decided that certain rights are extended to all and trying to protect those in the kinds of legislation that they put forward. Now, do they succeed? Is the balance struck right? I don't know. But it's sort of, you could argue in the wider scheme of things that's the noble interpretation of the function that the regulator is trying to solve for.
There is, and that's a very happy view of the world. Is government's role to optimize for human rights? Question. Yeah. And I think the answer is it.
They were meant to.
So somebody like me or you, it should be, but I'm not even sure. I think in many countries it's not meant to. That government is meant, certainly in many environments I think around the world, it's meant to optimize for social stability, which is a different thing from human rights.
It's a very different thing, you're right.
Yeah, and I think that's how they often see themselves. And so a lot of the laws that you see, and this is where it gets contentious, because you will have people in the platforms who are thinking government should be optimizing for human rights, and we're going to look at it, all the requests through that lens, and you have people in government saying, no, I'm optimizing for social stability.
Oh, this is a really big question, though, because I think that this is a viable question in almost any content moderation discussion you're having around regulation, because you should ask, really, truly, is this an expression of your willingness to protect basic human rights, or is this an expression for your willingness to protect social stability? Now, social stability is a really questionable function to optimize for, because social stability you can have in very authoritarian states. And in fact, that exact language is traceable to some very authoritarian states who use this in ITU contexts, for example. And so social stability versus human rights in terms of what the regulator should frame their work in is a bit of a, I think it's, I mean, I'm optimistic and naive and idealistic, and I take all of that, but I think that that's actually a key point for people to keep an eye on when they look at content regulation being introduced.
Yeah, it is exactly, and that's why the same regulation in the hands of a different country can have very different effects. And actually, if people are interested, go and look at the transparency reports that all the major platforms do about the government notices to take stuff down. And you'll see there are many, many thousands each month coming from more authoritarian countries. It tends to be, the greater volume tends to come from more authoritarian countries, and some democracies that have more law that's geared towards social stability. So again, the standard example is Germany, where Germany has a lot of law that really is designed with a sound logic, sort of post the Second World War. They they wanted to prevent social fracture and breakdown again, and so they have a lot of law that's geared towards that. So a lot of the takedown requests that platforms receive are in the name of social stability across all types of government, but where they are more likely to accept that an anti-sedition or anti sort of insurrection type request is okay is in a country which has a strong human rights culture, and where they're likely to reject that is in a country that has a weaker human rights culture. Now, of course, those latter group of countries will argue, well, the social stability ultimately is going to protect human rights. So maybe it's more about sort of atomic individual human rights today, or whole society human rights at some vague point in the future.
But it also matters, I think, how you motivate this, because it's one of the constant recurring tropes in the discussion about online platforms is that they're eroding democracy, and that's the kind of language that's being used. And eroding democracy, that means not that they're threatening human rights, but in many cases it actually means that they threaten social stability.
Yes.
That people start voting for the wrong parties and start behaving hatefully against each other. And it's interesting to tease that out, because if a lot of that criticism that we see is essentially based on the social stability argument, it would be interesting to see a line of criticism that was more oriented around the human rights argument. And I think it would look very different, because it would essentially be the kind of argument that says, well, you shouldn't take stuff down unless it's explicitly illegal, because this is actually a guarantor for some of our basic human rights.
Yeah, I think disentangling that is really interesting, because of course the US, which doesn't have a human rights convention in the way that Europe does, its rights are sort of enshrined within the Constitution, but it's a different model. It's not an explicit sort of list of rights that we see in the European Convention. But the United States, I think, would say that, in a sense, the reason they had their First Amendment approach, and that they were quite relaxed about speech previously, I think, was that they felt their social stability was guaranteed. They were very secure in their social stability. And so there was a it is extraordinary to people like us that they will let Nazis in Nazi uniform march through their towns, like something that's sort of really
it's bizarre.
It's bizarre. And the reason they could do that is because I think they had a very, very strong confidence in the institutions, and that their social stability was so strong that they didn't need to have speech restrictions in order to maintain social stability. And now you're seeing precisely that. You are seeing more people come out effectively and saying platforms restrict more speech because the speech is threatening social stability. So it is more
tearing
European
our society apart.
Exactly.
Yes.
Really.
Yes. That's worthwhile thinking about, because if you do optimize for social stability and you at some point are forced to sacrifice the sort of human rights that come into conflict with stability, you're building a very different society than if you build one that is sort of focused on human rights. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon here that I'd like to get back to. One of the things I noted a long time ago was that you would have a lot of people who were really close to the border of what was legal or not legal, and close to the border of what the community allowed for themselves or not. And I remember a lot of agonizing going into trying to figure out what to do with those edge cases. Why? Why did we spend so much time on edge cases?
Yeah, I think they're often the noisiest in terms of they get the most attention. And so there's a sort of squeaky wheel syndrome, which is, you put the oil on the squeaky wheel, and so you're not, the stuff that's just sort of working away is fine, but the stuff that's on the edge actually will get a lot of attention. And from a Facebook platform at the time point of view, one of the things that you could see was quite often the stuff that got the most distribution, because people were commenting and engaging on it, was stuff that was at the edge, and stuff that was more mainstream wasn't. So I think it's simply that. It's just that the edge cases get attention from the community, and therefore, that then focuses all of the action on them.
But there were also edge cases that didn't necessarily get attention from the community, but got a lot of attention from politicians, and where you were sort of constantly looking at them and saying, what principle are we protecting here? And I think that there was a sense, and this is interesting, the bleed over from the government function, where you're optimizing for human rights, into the platform function of optimizing for your reputation, where platforms were really trying to do what they felt was their task, the
Yes.
human rights task.
Yeah.
And that bleed over, I think, created a whole lot of interesting dynamics.
It does, and that then brings us to our last sort of big bucket of regulation, which is formal government regulatory oversight. So this is different from the spot laws that make individual pieces of content illegal to government saying, look, we are now going to take on ourselves the power to tell you how to do content moderation. Not what decision to make over each individual piece of content, but we're going to make you come and explain to us what your policies are, what you're doing about it, give us all the data, open up the kimono, I think is the phrase. Show us everything that's sort of going on in your platform and justify it to us, and if we're not happy, we can fine you or prosecute you in some way. So it's a very different, and that then does require, I think it's going to be really interesting because it's going to flush out a lot of these questions and bring them back to government. Government's now going to have, it's all about trading equities here, and government's now going to have to show if it doesn't like the trade-off that the platform has made, it's going to have to at least give us some sense of how it thinks that trade-off should be done differently. And there, actually, again, the UK is particular. I think the UK, this is very driven by child safety. So you say, what's the motivation? It's not about, there's certainly language around protecting human rights more generally, but in very particularly it's saying we need to protect the rights of children. Yeah. And children are being damaged online, and therefore we need to take powers to ourselves to tell platforms how they must regulate if there are children on their platform. That's the sort of the heart of what they're doing. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff sort of around that. European Union, there's certainly the child protection piece, but there's also, I think, a lot more explicitly in the Digital Services Act. It's around social stability, it's hate speech, social disorder, misinformation. That's much more, I think, sort of front and centre. But again, the dynamics can be the same. The European Commission and people in the member states are taking on themselves the power to hold the platforms accountable and potentially give them instruction if they think they're doing it wrong.
Should that then mean that we get a cleaner division of labor across the different people in the stack that you described? Because now that governments have stepped up and said we're going to do regulatory oversight, they could take care of all of those edge cases. They should be responsible for them. And frankly, in that world, what the platform should do is only optimize for its reputation. What the community does is optimize for the particular function the community has set itself, and the individual is still stuck with self-representation. Should that division of labor become clearer now when platforms don't have to do the oversight work? Will it be cleaner?
I mean, this is where I'm an optimist and a lot of other people aren't. They think it's going to be a disaster, but it all comes down to the quality of the regulators. And again, this is very particular to UK, Europe, because if you ask me the same question about other countries, was I comfortable with the Russian Duma giving their regulator equivalent powers? The answer would be no, because I don't think they would be exercised in the same way. But do I think that we could end up with a reasonably clean sort of understanding of who's doing what in the EU and the UK? I think yes, that's the outcome I'd like to see. Where again, as a citizen and a user, I felt I'd been missing an element, and the element is, what does government actually think? Yes. Because I know government thinks the platforms are doing a bad job, but I'm not as clear about what government thinks a good job looks like.
And of course, when we talk about governments, we talk about elected officials then putting agencies and regulatory officials in place. So we're talking about ourselves.
The institution of government, importantly. Yeah, not any individual politician,
no.
But what do we think institutionally? Just in the same way that institutionally, you know, I know what we think of murder or drug use, and those change over time. I know what the institutions think of using a drug like cannabis today, and politicians can change that, and so we can treat it differently tomorrow. But at any one moment in time, you have an understanding what the institution thinks. And
that decision should be there because of the democratic accountability for those governments should they go overboard, for example, right?
Exactly. That's the check and balance you rely on.
Which means that you actually could support democracy a little bit with this division of labor.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is more democratic if everybody is playing their part and the accountability mechanisms are there. The concerns, which I totally recognise, and I'll express myself when we're debating it, are, you know, that the regulator doesn't act like an institution but becomes a sort of expression of individual politicians' whims on a given day. So that sort of stuff would be problematic, or that they're not good enough to do the job effectively, that they don't have the capabilities that they need. They don't really understand what's going on. But I say ultimately, I think sharing that, or as a citizen, seeing sort of both points of view. I want to know what the platform thinks. I also want to know what my government thinks. That's going to be really important. The edge case points are fascinating. If I were still working in a platform, I would be constantly going to my regulator.
Here's an edge case.
Yeah. Because and then the regulator's going to go, look, we're not deciding individual cases, which is right.
Yeah.
But the regulator does have a view. The regulator in the UK says, look, you must have a duty of care, to protect people from certain types of content. And I would want to go to the regulator and say, look, if I let this content stay up, content of this class, here's 10 examples.
Yeah.
Do you think I've met my duty of care? Or do you think in order to meet my duty of care, I need to take this down?
Yeah.
And I'd want to have that conversation on a regular basis, because that's the point. The point of having the regulator is precisely to be able to give that kind of guidance.
And we have to come back to another point, which I think is interesting here, and that is that for that to work well, for the regulator and oversight to work well, for the regulation to work well, you need checks and balances somewhere else. And that's us as citizens and not users. Because we exist at 2 points in your value chain, right? We exist as users who post and can do auto content moderation, as you call it. But we also exist as citizens who are supposed to provide checks and balances on the way that the government exercises its power. Which means that for this all to become the kind of healthy, optimistic vision that you're espousing, we actually need more citizens to invest their time in thinking about human rights, thinking about expression, thinking about what reasonable the limitations are, which should mean also that the oversight should come with rich reporting, auditing, and accountability for the regulator.
Exactly. So that factor, how does the regulator get citizen input, is going to be crucial. And again, they have a lot of experience with this. Certainly the Ofcom, the UK one, has been doing broadcasting regulation for years. And broadcasting regulation, again, it's a similar exercise. You upset somebody. So there's a whole bunch of people who think something shouldn't have been broadcast. And there's a whole bunch of people who think, damn, I've got a right to broadcast that stuff. Damn, don't interfere with me. But they're used to trying to get the input and reconcile those viewpoints. So they're going to have to do that. I say it's going to be really hard for them.
It's going to be really hard. But Ofcom is really good, though. I mean, I think I have high hopes. I think that could work. I'm sort of with you on the optimism. Okay, so this is the model that you're going to publish on the blog.
Share some notes and sketches. Just it's really, I think, important that we do stand back sometimes and see if we're all talking about the same things.
And building this mental model also will help us as citizens to figure out what it is we want to look out for when we see content moderation from government oversight. Yeah. Which I think is a little bit of a checklist there on what should you as a citizen require if this new oversight is put in place. What would you like to know in order to hold the regulator accountable is a really important point that we haven't been discussing. We've been discussing what it means that there's regulatory oversight, and different kinds of pessimistic scenarios have been put forward. But at the end of the day, that is actually just not thinking that people are up to it.
Yes.
We need to be up to that accountability mechanism, the function of calling into question if this is the right balance that's being struck.
Play our part as citizens.
And citizens.
As to close with my conclusion is content moderation. It's a dirty job, but someone has to do it.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, you can find this blog on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
Thank you. And thanks for listening. And we hope we will have you with us soon again.